Afternoon or evening, wherever you're at in the world. We're excited that you can join us for the webinar today. Many of you are logging in later online for the recording of this, and we just want to thank you again for that. So my name is Dr. Erica Vonk. I'm professor here at Northwestern College, and then I also run our Center for Innovation and Leadership here at Northwestern College. So I have 4 panelists that are going to be part of our first hour session here. These are all different academic people from around the world that I think would be helpful for you to know and to meet and to network with. All 4 people you can find on LinkedIn. If you're interested in connecting more with them, reach back to me and I can connect you with emails and more information that way. So just to reach me, so you know, it's my first name, Erica.Vonk, my last name, at nwciowa.edu. So let's get started here today. I'm just going to read a brief bio kind of a person as I ask them to maybe answer a question here today. And then we'll go from there. So the first person that I would like to introduce to you is Jim. Jim Kuchar here. He is from the Baltimore area. And so he's associate professor of social innovation in the graduate school of the University of Maryland at Baltimore. He directs the groundbreaking Master of Science in Health and Social Innovation, postdoctoral work in urban ministry at St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute, and currently exploring the idea of church as a social enterprise. So he's a great example, again, of kind of what social enterprise is. So I'm going to kick us off with asking Jim, like, what is your definition of social enterprise?
So I've been in this space for almost 17 years, and Debbie has been in this space probably that long as well. And the fascinating thing is when we first started exploring this idea, people were getting doctoral dissertations arguing about what a social enterprise was and what a social enterprise wasn't. The even more fascinating thing is they're still getting doctoral degrees arguing about what a social enterprise is and what a social enterprise isn't. So, you know, a little bit of it is you know one when you see one. And I think it's often easier to sort of think about what it's not. It's not a specific tax status. It's not a specific legal structure. It's not a specific operating model. You can be a for-profit social enterprise. You can be a nonprofit enterprise. Here in the US, there's a wonderful organization called the Social Enterprise Alliance. Half of their members are for-profit entities. Half of their members are nonprofit entities. It doesn't matter how you organize. It's also not a business model. I think that's another really important thing for people to understand. So to me, what a social enterprise is a means to an end. And the end is some substantive way of improving the human condition. And how you get there is kind of secondary. The way the term became popular is when folks who were running nonprofits started to realize that developing some sort of earned income strategy could be useful in helping them stabilize their revenue stream. So that's kind of where it came from. And for a while, it sort of went off into this definition of a social enterprise is a business. And I kind of say, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I mean, it's got business ways of thinking. And I do believe that within the field, in terms of how folks practice it, there's still too much social and not enough entrepreneur in the social entrepreneurship space. So you still got to think about the basics of entrepreneurship and build business models and develop a value proposition and all that great stuff. But you then apply that to trying to develop some way of sustainably improving the human condition. So it's an answer that's not an answer, Erica, and that's not something you can put on a quiz, unfortunately, but that is what it is. And the other thing I think is the less time we spend defining them and the more time we spend trying to build them, the better off we'll be.
Great. Thank you so much. So we're going to kind of expand on that question a little bit with Debbie. So Debbie Brock is an internationally recognized expert on social entrepreneurship. She's a trainer consultant for various organizations, focusing on social innovation and just scaling social impact here. She previously taught at Miami University in Ohio, Berea College, and most recently Wingate University. Debbie has since joined Catalyst 2030, a growing network of social change leaders and the systems learning development facilitator back in 2021. So Debbie, my question for you kind of plays off of Jim's here, but how do all these other words, right, like impact, innovation, change, entrepreneurship, fundraising, philanthropy, venturing, ecosystems, how do these all connect with social enterprise?
I just want to point out you gave me the hardest question. So thanks for that, Erica.
You're welcome.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we know you can handle it.
Exactly. But innovative solutions, to solve these social problems is what we're trying to accomplish. And I agree with Jim on this earned income. If you look at throughout the US, it used to be 74%. I'm sure it's much higher. All of nonprofits have some form of earned income. So we need to have that entrepreneurial side of bringing in income. But that really innovative solution really is where you get to that higher scale opportunities. If I look at ecosystem building, I think that's the one piece for social entrepreneurs. If I don't have that ecosystem around me, I'm probably not going to be as successful as I could be. So thinking about it's not just me on an island by myself with my social venture. I'm also in partnership, whether it's government, local governments, or regional governments, or national. I have some governmental involvement along with moving towards achieving my systems change idea. I also might partner with private sector and other organizations, for-profit organizations. I might, the church you were talking about, faith-based social entrepreneurship. There be some connections in the community to other NGOs and organizations as well. So in building that ecosystem around me, funders are a piece of that. That will help the social venture become much more successful. At Catalyst, we always think about systemic change. So I don't want to just address the problem for today. I want to address the problem all into the future. So I'm solving it as opposed to just solving the need for today. And to do that systems level change, you really have to do those collaborations with that ecosystem. So building those partnerships with others. And what we're seeing in Catalyst and throughout the world is the social entrepreneurs who are working in partnerships together. Collectively, we can impact and go faster. I also want to point out about part of that ecosystem is our funders. And with our funders, we're trying to shift the mindsets. How do we get our social entrepreneurs to do things, our funders to do things differently? So I'm not just funding, again, the mission-based, we fund someone to go into a missionary in a country. I want to look at, if I gave this $30,000 that I'm going to fund someone to live in another country, and I gave it to members in the community to start social ventures or local, even small entrepreneurial businesses, and they have the money, so it's localized. They make decisions on how to build a business with it. They're going to come out and the impact's going to be much greater than me helping one individual. So we want to look at the funding, looking at we shift our funding. We're giving the resources locally to the people that need it the most to make the decisions for how that money should be spent. So I think long-term scaled sustained social impact really has to involve all the ecosystem actors.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's continue, Debbie, talking a little bit more about certain audiences here a little bit. So why is social enterprise, why is this word, this topic, this lifestyle for some people important to talk about even at like high school and college levels? Why should these students know this term, understand this ecosystem now that's created?
It's really fascinating. I think the work of Ashoka is the biggest organization that's funded social entrepreneurs around the world. And they really looked at the youth at being the future. If we get the young people and get them excited about social enterprise at a young age, then you're always thinking like what they call change maker, that change maker mindset. So I'm not doing my little fundraiser in my school to sell the candy bars, which drive me nuts, right? We start a little business or we start a little service and we make products. So we learn a skill, we come together collaboratively to work on a project, and then ultimately we build these skills and knowledge and we impact our community. So getting that entrepreneurialness in a younger age, really thinking about how I can change, I can make a solution as opposed to they're going to do it for me. The government's going to do it for me, or my teachers are going to fix this, or the principal needs to do that. The young people really need to embrace that they can affect that change. Same thing with college educated young people. They need to see at a young age to take that initiative to change the world. And the best time to do it is in school. You have nothing to lose, right? You have an infrastructure there supporting you along the way. So take those ideas and initiatives that you want to do, test them out. You got to market right there with students, see how it works, see it if people like the product or service, see if they're interested in it. And then you have really nothing to lose because you're able to do it within the umbrella of the university. And a lot of times there's a lot of support within the university. Plus, I'm sure Erica and the university is going to be doing more. Enactus, which is a student organization with 72,000 young people around the world. You know, Ashoka U is involved with young leaders as well. Catalyst is opening up to young social entrepreneurs. So there's lots more opportunities for young people to learn about social enterprise at a young age and to think and act like a change maker in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Next, I'd like to introduce David Beefus. So David and I have known each other for years, back with his connection to Northwestern College, but he has directed job creation projects for Opportunity International, World Relief, and World Vision. He has helped start microfinance programs in Latin America, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe. He currently lives in Florida. He's providing ongoing consulting services for job creation programs. Focused in Latin America and Africa through Seed Capital. So David, I'm curious, like with your past experiences, right? And now looking to the future, what's the future kind of in this area of work? What's the future of social enterprise?
The future is good. And I think that for those of you who live in the Orange City area, just remember back to whoever was in your families that settled you there. And the topsoil that goes so deep. I mean, when I lived there, I couldn't find the bottom of the topsoil. And when we walk over to the dining hall, the smell of the pig trucks that sometime went by, and I'd say to my students, that's the smell of money. But the thing is that your grandparents or great grandparents went there looking for a way to provide them for themselves. And today, the need for people to provide for themselves, as was said previously, the idea of earned incomes is even more popular. And just understand that that has two sides to it. On the one side, people want to make a living, you know, they want to have a living for themselves and their family. And on the other hand, all these aid agencies just can't afford to fund everything with handouts. I worked with the UN for a while, and, you know, we had a really big project for social enterprise. But the whole thing of the director, this was in Honduras, it wasn't anything to do with enterprise. It was to cut down what we had to order to take care of all of these refugees. So on those two fronts, it's a very good field, I think, an interesting field. On the other hand, I just want to mention that it's much more complicated. I did a project in Haiti after the earthquake. We created over 1,000 jobs, many. This was through compassion at the time. If I look at Haiti today, it's worse. I mean, the people need jobs just the same, but there's one big issue that wasn't perhaps as pervasive during my career, is security. I have helped many young people get jobs in development agencies, and I always tell them there's a lot of dangerous places you can get the jobs easily, right? But I don't tell them that so flippantly anymore, because it seems like, number one, the world has got a lot more dangerous. And so the projects themselves, and especially the involvement of expatriates involved in those projects, I mean, the way that people are making money in Haiti right now is if you visit, they'll kidnap you and hold you for ransom. So that's the business. But there's other issues, and another issue is that there is more accountability. Some of you may remember the good old days of Mohammed Yunus and creating a world without poverty. There's a professor at the University of Michigan, Karnani, who's debunked Mohammed Yunus in a way, and he said, if this microcredit is to help the poor, how come people in Bangladesh are still so poor? And so the big agency, somebody mentioned the idea of funding. If you talk with people in the IDB or the World Bank or USAID, they've read these people and they say, okay, we understand the microcredit boom. are the people better off after it? And they want to evaluate that. So the security part and then also the impact evaluation part and looking for solutions. If you want to do an interesting project about this related to job creation, look up the word missing middle, the missing middle in development finance. There's a lot of funds available to start a little business, but according to Carnani, a lot of these people are just as worse off. They become dependent on the little microcredit. But there's no money to start what's called SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So the interesting thing then is to be open to the need to be able to create things that are truly viable in the long run. And my last big overseas project was after the Civil War in Colombia. There was the most misplaced people in this hemisphere. And we went there and created jobs after that. But you know, the issue is fraught with problems, and a lot of the problems are related to the drug trade. So I don't know. I see it as a real big area that there. And if you look up the job possibilities, like in devx.com, where they're hiring for positions, a lot of them talk about livelihoods and that. But then it's also, I see a world of a lot more complications.
Yeah, thank you, David. Next, I'd like to introduce our fourth panelist here today. So Dr. Robert James Crammond, he's a senior lecturer in enterprise at the University of the West of Scotland, an author, a business consultant, a speaker. His interests are more in the entrepreneurship education, progressing the enterprise-centric stakeholder theory. So I'm excited to bring over Scotland into our session today as well. So Robert, kind of playing off of what David said as well, but what are some opportunities that you feel like exist in this ecosystem, and then challenges that are facing things in this ecosystem, and especially from different parts of the world, different levels of high school to college to adult, living in this ecosystem?
Yeah, of course, and thanks very much for the invite to this very interesting and international webinar. In terms of and going back to our first question about social enterprise and how we understand it, and I think what's been touched upon really well here from the outset was this idea of that we need to see it in action and consider more about the context rather than the concept of social enterprise and how we get things into action. Because I see social enterprise as this idea that it goes beyond this capitalistic connotation, as I put it in my classes, and that it's a very much a pluralistic endeavour involving lots of stakeholders. So when you think about the opportunities, it's very much that you have that array of different anecdotal evidence or experiences from people. So for a social enterprise, it's being aware of the context and the people factor within businesses first and foremost. Because as you've said, this idea of the end goal for social enterprise, reaching that end goal, what do we want to achieve? And you work your way back in terms of the tools and the methods towards reaching that. That's very important. So the opportunity of this rich and deep information or data from a research academic perspective of how we gather in terms of market information. So that's one point of view. The second is also, of course, not just the stories, but it's pulling and sharing the resources and expertise. So whether it's managing of an idea, which within my own teaching, I talk about the creative and cognitive aspects. So you've got the idea to begin with. Then you're managing the business, working within the business and dealing with the structures and strategies. And then managing people, the human resource. So when you think of a social enterprise, all of this relates to, of course, what people can add to the business. And within an ecosystem, it's touching upon those expertise that are very important, but with a view to where is the social application? So where do we see the end goal here? And we see within entrepreneurship education, for instance, how we look to adapt to, and with work that I'm doing at the moment with a university in Ireland about sustainable development goals and how we align our work towards how it becomes impactful towards national and international remit or frameworks. And second of all, about entrepreneurial competency. So when we think of something like within education or a social enterprise startup accelerator scenario, both of these are very educational, but it also becomes a sort of intervention or enlightenment of these are the particular competencies that are relevant for this in the business, or to engage with social aspects for the business for this as well. So that second point of going beyond stories, but then of pulling and sharing resources are key. But another challenge is, of course, what we see with any enterprise, social enterprise, not for profit, it's at the mercy of the market. So you have the bureaucracies that are involved with that, the market push and pulls, etc. And that goes back to the capitalist connotations. So with a social enterprise, it's very much a PR exercise. How can we show that we're doing this? It's because of the people and for the people, and to bring about an enriching of communities, etc. And I think that's what was discussed at the very top of today, looking at the end game and improving the human condition. So it's where a business has, of course, to put these building blocks in place, but also it's a PR exercise. We need to make sure you tap into that, the social benefit. So moving on further on from the challenges, okay, you think of something that I've mentioned in one of my books, time, talent, and technique. When are these social enterprises going to be making a timely impact? Do we have the talent, and through what means do we do that? So again, when we think of the opportunities and challenges, it does go back to what we talk about within educational forums, about the building blocks and the different resources that are needed. But it all comes down to, that's great, but so what? And by what I mean by the so what is, what are we responding to the needs of society? Are we doing our market research? Are we doing our homework? And a lot of that comes down to with the class that I'm teaching at UWS. It's the biggest enterprise course for our undergrads, and this week it's great. We're assessing their presentation pitches and all their ideas, and I always say, okay, well, does the customer need that? Would your operations benefit a gap in the marketplace? Will it bring about job creation? Will it bring about a sustainable change in the product or service? Will it be cost effective, etc.? So all of these things go back to, well, if you don't think of these things, society will come back, and you'll get that kickback from consumers and from the surrounding pressure groups, etc. So it's always that case of, we know how businesses can get started, but so what? What do we need to think about here? And the last 2 points are that we think of an ecosystem. It's very much, you've got all of these points in place, but you need that synergy and a consensus. So again, it's making sure that the network is lively and it's constantly in engagement. It's something that, for instance, yesterday I was dealing with looking at a lot of business ideas and speaking to a lot of people in the network in Glasgow and Lanarkshire within the west of Scotland. And it's a lot of discussion of their ideas, how to get it off the ground and development. And a lot of that is where we host our networking events on site. So just by virtue of having that open door policy, we're engaging and maximising our knowledge transfer. And lastly, about a particular challenge for the ecosystem, when we talk about this idea of the human condition and the building blocks for business, but so what? It's also legacy building. So we need to think of, where can we see the succession planning of what can businesses do to grow and diversify, to not only just meet the marketplace in terms of societal expectation, but also beat the marketplace to say, well, this is the standards that should be set for for the human condition and dealing with society and improving communities and groups. So in short, this idea of capturing knowledge and reaching a consensus, but it's where we can think of dealing with these typical business and capitalistic connotations with, always think of with social enterprise, what can we do in terms of, the shaping and representation of our business, that we're tapping into and have our finger on the pulse of communities and groups.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I love the word synergy, right? And thinking about the opportunity and how it does take that energy, and just thinking through the so what, right? That's a great question to always ask when we think about new options, new ideas, new ventures that are being talked about. So thank you so much.
Can I add another quick point for your?
Yeah, please.
This is something that I think is particularly important for a student audience to understand. And it has to do with this ecosystem point that Robert just did such a wonderful job of talking about. There's an old definition of an entrepreneur that says an entrepreneur is someone who pursues an opportunity without full possession of all of the resources at hand to necessarily succeed in pursuing that opportunity, right? And I think the same goes for ecosystems, right? And I know in my experience in training social entrepreneurs, sometimes you have to build and put together the ecosystem yourself, And I think it's particularly true in this space because what's a sufficient ecosystem for one venture may not be a sufficient ecosystem for another venture. You know, we've talked about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You know, if you're pursuing an anti-poverty strategy, your ecosystem is going to look very different from if you're trying to, reduce the incidence of folks who are not housed, right? So, you know, there's not, and I think in entrepreneurship in general, we sort of fail in that regard too, where we think of, oh, here's the ecosystem go. Well, you're a tech company versus, a finance company versus whatever. So, you know, I want to make sure that a student audience understands that ecosystem isn't something that just exists and you say, oh, here's my ecosystem, let me go. You know, you have to build that as well as building your venture. You have to build your ecosystem.
Yeah. So again, that circles back to networking, right? And knowing your audience and knowing your team, right? And who's going to surround you in that. And that's part of why, even with this event, we wanted to have this in-person option for some networking, right? And trying to teach people how to start to build that ecosystem as well. So let's kind of keep playing off of this. I'm going to circle back to Debbie. For people that are listening in, even if this isn't like your main calling, right? If this isn't your dream in life, per se, how can people still get involved, still support others, you know, in social enterprise, support others that are doing good, right, around the world?
I think it's especially when you look at student populations and we're trying to help students find their calling and where they belong, that even with Jim and I came from entrepreneurship education originally, and we, you know, a large percentage of students would have this idea, I want to be an entrepreneur, but in reality, they weren't going to be an entrepreneur, but they were going to work with entrepreneurs. So that idea of learning what it's like to be a social entrepreneur, understanding mission-based organizations, understanding what's called triple bottom line. So doing business with profit, but also looking at the people and the equity and fairness with the people that you hire, with who you're serving, and then also looking at the environmental or planet impacts. Understanding that type of a business model is an important thing to learn. When I look at Jason and the folks that are in the religion department and religious studies, ultimately what Jim said is that a church is a social mission. And so it's trying to bring people together. And when you're thinking about that, I need to have business skills. I need to understand the social impact of my work. So having students and young people look at the different paths that are available to them. I love the idea of the minors because they're allowed to have a major in some area that they're interested in, but having this minor certificate in social entrepreneurship allows them to kind of put the toes in and understand more about what it involves. And when I think of young people getting excited, they get excited about impact. So we know the data tells us that this generation of young people really want to give back. They want to make a difference. They're not going after the jobs in corporate America, which was, how do I get the biggest car, the biggest house, make the most money? They now say, well, I don't know if I want to spend the next 30, 40 years of my life in something I don't care about. I want to have a position and work with people that makes an impact. And so looking at social entrepreneurship as a pathway for that is another avenue to help you. I love what Robert said about, we look at your time, your talent, and your techniques. Social enterprise is going to give you the techniques that you need to be successful, whether you choose to do it in your, as a social venture, a for-profit or nonprofit, whether you choose to do it in your community organization, whether you choose to do it in your faith-based organization. You're going to build those skills and talents to be successful in those areas. I'll also do a plug for Social Change Innovators, which is an online portal for knowledge resource portal for social entrepreneurs. It was originally designed for academics that were teaching in this space, because back in 2003, when I started, there wasn't anything but a couple of articles and things. Nobody really had any books or, reports or materials that we could work with. And so we curated all that knowledge. And now with Catalyst 2030, it's available to social entrepreneurs as well. And we're also having regional content available, and we're hoping to get more language content. So if you want to share any resources on that platform, it's co-created with other people from around the world, social innovators, impact actors, etc. So there's a resource to share.
Yeah,
as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I think, again, being a part of some ecosystem, right? That's a way for you to, again, not maybe take the lead, but be that supporting role for people that are trying to make a difference in the world. And I guarantee you can find someone that's trying to make a difference and be that support system for them. So, so let's talk about how do we find this? So Robert, if you're passionate about this, if you're caring about what we're talking about today, how does one kind of start this? How do we find a support system for social enterprise? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think for this question, I think it's really important because it brings about this idea of, the personal ambition, the interpersonal skills that are required, and also being aware of the here and now. So when I think of whether it's a business or social enterprise, first of all, I'd say it's transparency. So in terms of someone's intentions and ideas, they're being clear about this is what the business is about. It needs to be based on information and research, as in, we see a particular problem and this is a gap or opportunity in the market to deal with. But first and foremost, when it's a social enterprise, it's probably something where in their immediate community, whether it's through experience or lifestyle or a challenge that they're undertaking, being transparent and saying, well, this is what we witness and what we need to approach is very important. And with a social enterprise, you'd find that it's obviously based on shared beliefs and this motivation for change. So having the shared belief in that system of, okay, who can join this, who subscribes to this notion of there's a gap or a challenge or opportunity to deal with. And that should then bring about the experiences, bring about new ideas that are instigated towards proactive action. I think the other point is as well that with the support system, it's also appreciating from the get-go, and I think Jim mentioned this just at the end of question 5, that no one has all the answers, or there's a place where you have to build a network. And it's through that day-to-day learning curve. Because as we mentioned, that entrepreneurship is based upon, opportunities, raising social conditions, human conditions we're specifying today, but it's also process-oriented. The business goes through those phases of startup development, etc. So enterprise is very much a process-driven or process-oriented regime of activity, and that thrives on lively networks. So when we think of, finding that support system, there are a number of different, aspects of that, or it's very multifaceted in terms of the support system. Having the experience of business leaders is great, but for social enterprise, it's those that are the leaders or spokespeople for the actual problem at hand. We can think about business leaders within a given sector that have the sector knowledge, but there's also with social enterprise, it's very much a qualitative exercise. It's to understand the why and the how rather than the what, where, and when. And that's what separates it from your profit-making business. A business can look at and say, well, okay, this is what we need to provide. This is where the business is going to be profitable, and this is when we're going to strike with that idea. But when you think of social enterprise, it's very much the how and why. How can this make change, and why should we be doing it? So that moves it on to this qualitative aspect. Then, of course, consumer or society. So the trends and perception. When we think of society as a whole, where do we see this motivation for change, and then where can we gather that feedback periodically and consistently through that? But away from this idea of leaders in society is also, in terms of a support system, the role of the university is really important. The idea of incubation or accelerator spaces, as this brings about this systematic nature of enterprise development. So when we think of social enterprise, whether it be through state assisted funding or the role of educators and incubation spaces, we can see there that it can be a thriving network if then you're able to tap into it and realise that you have your strengths and opportunities there, but it's know your limitations, that you won't have all the answers there. And as I've noted here and from the discussion, we talk about social enterprise as this mindful and responsive action. And with that, it should be about progressing ideas and creating opportunity. So through this network, it's knowing that there's many questions that you should have as a business founder when it comes to social enterprise, always that kind of so what, why and how aspect. And I think that because it involves very much moving away from the money-oriented or the push and pull market forces, we think of social enterprise, and especially for those coming through high school, university, etc., think of social enterprise as very much of, where can this bring about pragmatic and more instant change? Where can we be responsive? And that brings about, I would say, as we mentioned in our classes, like the Avengers model, the different people with the different skill sets, and how you can bring about the experience, but also that technique, as I mentioned before, to engage with the market with meaningful and pragmatic objectives. So in short, this idea of transparency is important, but knowing that it's a very much the different stakeholders, the different groups that not just bring about the idea, but its purpose and its application.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I think for people to know, look for those support systems in your community, right? And the education systems that are around you. And then really there's so many facets around the world, right? If you start looking into like-minded, right, issues, like-minded topics and things like that. So thank you. The next question I'm going to ask both to David and Jim. And so I'm going to probably let David speak first here, but part of what we're doing here today is also kind of bridging this faith integration part that sometimes happens in social enterprise. And so, David, how have you seen faith integration with social enterprise kind of as this cooperative ecosystem, whether it be collaborations, facilities, missions, community-based things? What have you seen in that space?
Well, to start with, just to remember that in the very first letter in the New Testament and First Thessalonians, the guy who wrote it said very specifically, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so you'll not be dependent on anybody. As I've traveled in different places, I've found that, pastors and missionaries don't really use this verse too much because they're afraid people are going to stand up and say, hey, how do I do this? But it is a statement about, have a business to support yourself. And it's followed up with a second letter to the same church that says, many of you just come to church to get a handout. I make this rule, if you don't work, you don't eat. It's very, very dogmatic. And that's by the guy presenting the Christian faith, following in the footsteps of the Jesus who we celebrated his resurrection this weekend, who was also a worker person, and who, in him teaching people to pray, said, give us this day our daily bread, which probably wasn't about getting Social Security from the government or a handout from World Vision sponsorship or something. It was probably about, give us this day our daily bread, give us a way to make the money that we can so that we can provide for ourselves. So given that the faith, the Christian faith, comes also from God, the creator, who worked 6 days and rested from his work, and who created man to work to provide for himself. I think that you have a long history, not just now, but in the recent couple hundred years. I just have to have, as a professor, have these books. This Prophet for the Lord is out of print, but a history of the church and its promotion of work through the centuries. What you do find and like you see in my resume, working with agencies like World Vision or Compassion or whatever, that there is a big concern that people have a way to have a job. Now, again, even then, that is what professors tend to do. I just want to make sure that present the other side of it, and that is that these ideas get into the hands of fundraisers, who then present the idea of job creation programs. And the one that's popular in some circles, maybe some of you have this book, BAM, Business's Mission. The problem is that the hype has gone way beyond. Somebody said at the beginning that with enterprise, generally you kind of want enterprise to at least be self-sufficient, not to require a subsidy. And the sad fact of a lot of the business's mission projects, as they're articulated right now in at least the US environment, is that they're projects that use that term to raise money, but if you look at them closely, they don't make a profit. Which, again, even going back to this whole subject, starting with the definition, the real problem with the word enterprise, and if we're talking about business, is that business isn't easy. I mean, that's the thing. To make money, to have an activity, to have a productive economic activity where what you sell generates more than what you spend, is just really, I think it's a wonderful challenge. The environment changes and you have to change with the environment, but that isn't easy. But just to respond to the question again, it has been something that's been taken up by a lot of mission agencies and Christian organizations, as they see that people want a job, not a handout. They will take a handout and they'll become like the people that Paul is criticizing in 2 Thessalonians, but that's not good for them. I mean, it's not just that it's expensive, it's not good to be dependent. And so the principle of being able to support yourself is a very central principle, I think, to the Christian view.
Thank you, David. So Jim, just to kind of follow up on those thoughts, just how have you seen faith integration, this cooperative system?
Yeah, thank you, David. Great context there. And I think I'm going to exercise a little bit of a prerogative here and ask for Jason to chime in a little bit as we sort of riff on this point as well. But I kind of take a little bit more pragmatic approach to this question. And it comes from two sides. Within religious contexts, one of the things that I find fascinating is that anybody who feels that they are called to serve as a religious leader, priest, pastor, rabbi, imam, whatever your calling may be, undertakes substantial training. But nowhere in that training is there any conversation about what it's like to run a small nonprofit. And yet the minute you land in that congregation that you are now charged to lead, you are in fact running a small nonprofit. And if you go back to the conversations we've had about social enterprise, the reason that the term became popular was because nonprofits realized that the traditional funding model of, as a friend of mine says, literally and figuratively begging for change just isn't sustainable over time, right? So, passing the plate is not a great way to earn revenue, particularly with, buildings that are aging, congregations that are closing left, right, and sideways, right? So I sort of look at it from that side as, how can we support that community to continue to do what it's actually called to do, as opposed to what it ends up doing, which is trying to keep the lights on and keep the roof from falling in. So that's kind of one side of it. On the other extreme, I sort of look at it as, if your goal is to improve the human condition, then you must at some level have some amount of empathy. And empathy comes from care and concern, and that is inherently a spiritual concept. So, I sort of look at it as, if this is something that you think is worth pursuing, then you are, whether you realize it or not, almost definitionally coming at it from a faith-based lens in some way. And then last but not least, to underscore David's point about how hard it is, right? The phrase I use is that social entrepreneurship is messy, because you're not only trying to build a business, you're trying to produce social change, and you're trying to do them both at the same time in the same thing, right? So it's really nuts. That in and of itself is an act of faith to try and undertake that. So, there's a couple of different pieces in there, but I particularly love what y'all are doing in terms of actively bringing theological perspectives into this conversation, because I think it's a huge thing, and I think it's something that is grossly ignored, perhaps even actively rejected in many conversations around social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. And interestingly enough, in the nonprofit space, you see that also in certain circles actively rejected. And in others, you do see it sort of embraced a little bit more. So that's just kind of, but Jason, I'd love to hear what you have to add to that.
Sure. Yeah, I would say a couple of things. First of all, to your first point, I'm increasingly coming to see that I think that pastors, leaders of congregations should be bivocational. So just a little backstory. I've helped start a church with a Latina friend in Sioux Center. It's a bilingual, multi-ethnic congregation, and both of us have day jobs. And what it does is it frees up the congregation to be less concerned about how do we, who's giving us money and how can we be kind of more outwardly focused. And what does that look like for pastors to become more bivocational? Now, I'll tell you, I have friends who are pastors who they don't like it when I talk about this. So I understand it's a paradigm shift, but it actually isn't a paradigm shift if you go back to 1 Thessalonians and that text. It's interesting. So I don't know if there's a book that I use in our spiritual formation class by a guy named Mark Sampson. I think he studied in the UK. He's from the UK, and he talks a lot about human flourishing. He actually uses Pope Benedict, an encyclical that Pope Benedict wrote, and wants to talk about, what does human flourishing look like and how does it connect with the idea of being made in the image of God? And that's a big focus of my area, is to try to help young people understand that maybe the purpose of pastoral ministry and the purpose of ministry is to help people live into their humanity, made in the image of God, redeemed. We just celebrated Easter and the new humanity of Jesus Christ. And what does that mean for work and the dignity of work and flourishing and all of these types of things? And so I agree with everything that, is being said here. I do have some questions, and if no one else wants to pop in with questions at the end, I'll bring those questions up. That's my 2 cents for now.
All right. So for those of you that have been online joining us, there have been some great resources posted into the chat. So make sure you're kind of peeking at those, following those, grabbing those links out if you want to save those through the chat as well. So Jason is the co-host of our event today. So Jason is in the Biblical and Theology Studies department here at Northwestern. So Jason's been kind of monitoring the chat as well. So if you have questions, make sure to throw those in that chat space. Jason, I guess for now, do you want to just jump into questions either that people have posted or that you want to add into this conversation now?
I don't see any questions, but these might be questions. They're kind of more practical questions. So one of the interesting things was, well, no, let me start with this one. I think this is a very basic question. Like, what should somebody do if they want to get started? Like, let's say we got a person who's a high school student or a college student, and they have an issue that they're passionate about, and they feel passionately that they want to use business to do this. What's the starting place?
I'll tell you what the starting place isn't, which is to go file for 501c3 nonprofit tax status, which is what most people that feel a call to a social problem do first. Several reasons. It takes $10,000 in 18 months, among other things. Second, 501c3 is a tax status, not an operating model, right? So I would say the most important thing, in my opinion, if you think you have concern for a particular aspect of the human condition, the most important thing you can do first is find those people that are experiencing that negative condition and talk to them and understand their lives and ask them what they think might help. And then
so
listen.
Getting that market research. Yeah, I think that's
in the entrepreneurship sense is the market research. In the social side, we call it community engagement. Mm-hmm. Customer discovery is another word for it, right? But I also think that there's a huge problem in the social change space with what a friend of mine calls the white savior industrial complex, which is we parachute into a neighborhood and say, I know what's right for you, here it is, and I'm going to bring it to you. Mm-hmm. And the people in the community say, huh?
Yeah, I mean, that's just to piggyback off of that. One of my other areas of focus is immigration work. And that is a question we wrestle with all the time. We have an increasing Latino population in this area. And the question is how do we connect with resources and how do we actually meet needs to allow people within this community to flourish and to start businesses and all those types of questions. So I appreciate that that idea. But I don't know, anyone else on where should somebody start?
I'll put a couple resources in the chat. I love how Ashoka does the Everyone a Changemaker resource. So you'll see on the Ashoka website, they'll say Everyone a Changemaker and what you can do to get started with that. There's a curated resource that was done by the Ashoka U group, Change Making 101. So like the basics of, I want to be a change maker, what do I need to do? So that's another resource available to you as well. And then I'll also share, there's educator resources that are shared by the Ashoka team. And I will put that in the chat as well. So, and when you follow up with the folks that registered, I'm sure you can add some of these links in the chat or into that email that might be helpful as a starting point. The second thing I would say is go into your community, talk to other change leaders, talk to whether it's government officials, somebody locally, it could be your pastor from your church or faith-based organization. It could be a professor on campus and say, I'm really passionate about this, but I'm not really sure where to start. I don't know how many students that when they heard entrepreneurship and social put together and learned the definition, they were like, that's what I want to do. But they never thought they were going to be a business person, right? Because entrepreneurship is for profit, right? And it's like, no, you can do social enterprise, you can do nonprofit, for profit. And I think that was super helpful. David shared a link on DevX with job opportunities, and I can share links as well.
Yeah, no, I've actually had students sit in my office who, when I explain to them what it is, their face lights up and they have their epiphany. By the way, Kenny Cluett from Ashoka is going to be on the next panel, so he will be hopefully sharing also some of these ideas. Let me ask one more question, if it's okay, Erica. I think we got about 5 minutes left or 4 minutes left, but and maybe this is directed towards Robert. And this is interesting. As you think about capitalism and as you think about marketization, one of the questions has to do with capitalism, and it has its own way of functioning, and can it can be a solution, but it can also create issues and problems. How, when you bring the social aspect of this in and trying to meet needs of people and human flourishing, how does that work? How do the bad parts of capitalism, how do we try to push those, keep those at bay? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what Jim was saying about, and what Debbie mentioned also about speaking to people. So when I think of social enterprise, yes, it does involve those building blocks of an enterprise and getting it moving, but it is relying on resources which are mutually beneficial, but also going back to those stories. So we think about a business and being within a capitalistic framework, you will, it's all about the profit making, the competition, and the customer retention. It's all about the one. What can we grab and what can we retain onto? But when we think of social enterprise, yes, an organisation has to still be involved in working with people. So a lot of it does come down to, as I said, that PR exercise aspect, where it's bringing it back to what are the core values of the business. And for a social enterprise, it needs to be that in engaging with people to utilise their potential solutions, so that not only is it inclusive of those people, but it's also inclusive of the solutions of those people within a given region or sector or community, etc. So in terms of kind of removing the business away from those kind of capitalistic connotations, as I talk about, competition, profit seeking, this, customer sort of a land grab, for a sector or customer, it is very much the idea of rooting your business into keeping that positive brand perception.
Okay.
And that comes with the stories that are told and making sure they're part of that journey. And that sounds like a sort of fluffy concept of the journey, but it is very much that the business has to be found upon. These are the solutions that we feel or we've found from other people, and they join the journey. Otherwise, it loses its sense of the societal direction or the societal strategy.
Sure.
Jason, I think we also need to understand a couple of things. First of all, capitalism is a human construct. It's not a natural law.
Sure.
Right? It's an economic system that humans constructed. There are others. Secondly, I think we need to make a distinction between modern extractive capitalism and what some of the early capitalist thinkers wrote about. You know, Adam Smith wrote about the theory of moral sentiments and the moral obligation that came with the creation of wealth. My personal opinion is that social enterprise actually is a way to redeem capitalism.
Yeah.
And return it to what it was meant to be, which is a way actually, you know, I mean, Henry Ford wasn't trying to build a global automobile megalopolis. Henry Ford was trying to build an employment engine.
Right.
He was trying to build steady jobs for people.
Yeah.
You know?
Let me ask, there's one question and then we're gonna make a switch, but we actually got a question from someone watching, so I think we should ask it. And then Bailey has just jumped on, and Bailey's going to be in the next session. But here's the question: what are the impact of emerging social enterprise models on legacy nonprofits and the type of leadership they need in the coming years?
That's a great question with 2 minutes left. Oh my God.
Yeah, exactly.
Who would like to take it?
I think the legacy nonprofits really have to put the mirror back on themselves and say, am I really serving the community in the best way that I can? Am I really putting the right resources in the hands of the right people? We realized even with Catalyst that we were too top heavy on higher salaries. And we said, you know what, we're gonna take that money and give it to more entry-level positions, because we are going to get more people more passionate about more opportunities that we're going to do. Giving money into the community directly, as opposed to your organization taking the money and then you're passing it around, but you're always taking a percentage of that funding. So always thinking about reposition yourself and say, are we achieving the impact we originally planned to achieve? And if we're not, then we need to shut down and maybe restart something different. And I've seen so many universities had to do this in 2008. And I remember Berea College, we were spending $8,000 per student on a summer program. And we just put our lens on and said, this is insane. It was a great program, but not for the cost. We should just give $8,000 to a bunch of kids and see what they can do with it. So really put your lens backwards at yourself.
I'm going to go way out on a limb here and say there should be no such thing as a legacy nonprofit. If your mission is to create a change in the human condition, and you've been in business for 50 years in the same neighborhood, shame on you.
Well, with that, Erica, I'll let you close this
How's that
So
for
here's the thing. Great question. If you want to type back into the Q&A quickly yourself and give a little more to that question, panelists, you're welcome to do that quickly. So we just want to say thank you again for your time, defining social enterprise, introducing this term, this concept, this ecosystem to our audience. The next panel session then will transition into those that are in this space, actively living this out, engaging with people around the world as well. So thank you again for your time. Let's transition to panel.
So we're going to get started. And so first of all, welcome. We put this together. We started a social enterprise major here at Northwestern. And it came out of this idea. I kept having students come in. I teach in the biblical theological studies department. And I kept having students come in and say, I'm kind of interested in ministry, but not youth and not this. And so with Kurt Ridema from Kansas City, who some of you know, I had a conversation about social enterprise, got talking with Erica, and we came up with this major. And so this is really a kind of platform for us to kind of get the major out there and get people thinking. We just had an academic panel from kind of some of the professors, professor world. And we have a networking session later in Sioux Center, Iowa, which is where I live. It's a town close to here, where we're going to try to connect people with some resources. But this is a panel where it's really about more practitioners and, to hear from your experience and what have you been doing and how did you get into this work, those types of questions. So what I'd like to do is just kind of go around and have you just take some time to introduce yourself. Who are you? Where are you working? And then maybe also talk about how in the world did you end up in this work? And then we'll kind of go from there. So I'll kind of call on people. That seems to work the best. So we'll start on my screen. I have Bailey kind of right next to me. So Bailey, why don't we start with you and we'll just kind of work our way around.
Great. So my name's Bailey Eby, and I'm one of the co-founders of Dreamer & Co. My other co-founder is Jessica Gardner. And we started Dreamer & Co. back in 2018. Dreamer & Co., we're an ethical jewelry brand. So our mission is to empower women through dignified employment and also inspire conscious consumption. So there's kind of a dual nature in the work that we do. We're both connecting consumers with handmade products that are produced transparently and ethically and teaching them more about what that means. And then also providing job skills and fair wages to women. So we partner with 11 artisans in the Horn of Africa. And then we also just launched recently a refugee job program in the DC area where we've hired a refugee woman from Afghanistan who is now working for us. And we started, kind of the journey started back in 2014, 2015. Jessica and I were both connected to a nonprofit called Global Aid Network, which is now called Unto. It's Campus Crusade's Campus Crusade, their humanitarian arm. And so we were both, she was working for them and I was interning for them at the time. She had gone to the Horn of Africa on a trip and had met the artisans. And then I kind of 6 months later went and we both kind of had shared experiences. Her and her husband ended up moving there to work with the local organization that is in the country. And I had reached out to her and told her about my time meeting the artisans, and we were thinking of ways of how we could help them. The local nonprofit had created a vocational center for these women, teaching them different skills like sewing and jewelry making, but they didn't really have a place to sell their goods in the marketplace. The country is very small. There's not a lot of tourism in the country. And so they had this skill and this passion, but no place to put it out into the world. So we, over a year or so, had conversations with them after Jessica had moved there about whether they wanted to partner with us to get their products into a more globalized market. So it took us 2 years from then, that was 2016, 2018, after prototyping and praying and planning, we launched Dreamer & Co. And we're a for-profit business that has this mission of empowering these women. And then later down the road, this past June, we decided to kind of branch out and also have some local impact in the DC area, which comes from a couple of like supply chain problems that we ran into that we decided to bring some production stateside. And then there's also just a huge need in the DC area, in a lot of places in the US, but in the DC area, particularly for Afghani refugees.
Awesome. That's great. And we'll dig a little bit more into, like, as you look at it, like how are things going and what are some challenges? So we'll kind of come back to that with some other questions. But Chelsea, let's have you go next. So just introduce yourself and then maybe talk about how you got into the work that you're doing.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Chelsea M. And I think you all will find this very funny. Maybe not funny, maybe sad for me. But I actually have a terminal degree in education. So I have been teaching for over 10 years. I finished my PhD last March, and then I left teaching to pursue this journey of being a full-time entrepreneur in May. So you can imagine my family is like, what is going on with you? I also had a baby last year. It was just a lot. And so I think one thing I'm learning throughout this entrepreneurial journey is that all of my skills from education are very transferable. And so let's go back to July of 2020 when this all got started before I made that drastic decision. I was a literacy coach at the time, just teaching children how to fall in love with reading and helping educators. And I got laid off due to COVID. And so that job was 100% travel. In that, I decided, well, we're in the brim of the pandemic. A lot was going on as far as the Black Lives Matter movement and just all these different things about wanting to support locally. My husband and I, we had just moved to Kansas City for his job. And so I was like, well, I don't really know anyone here, but I would like to support. So I go to a search engine that I feel like you should be able to support from. Nothing was there. I found very misleading information. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to create something for millennials that's fun, fast, and easy for them to relate to. That was the whole small idea, right? So fast forward until now, what we've grown into is kind of this organization. We're for profit. We're trying to be nonprofit. I'm still learning, right? Like I just have education, not entrepreneur background. So I'm learning as I go. We're this for-profit organization that we're kind of the Lorax. We speak for the trees of Black-owned businesses. So one thing I really tried to use from my teaching is what's the problem here and how can we be a solution? So I realized the problem was that Black-owned businesses, Black entrepreneurs, they were difficult to find outside of your hair and beauty and just other types of things that you're commonly known for. And so Bailey, like, your organization makes me think of Tears of Design, which is one of our entrepreneurs. All of her employees are survivors of sex trafficking. So they're now working to build up their, economy and get money. And so just do these different things. But like outside of that, no one would know that that's that type of business, right? They would just say, oh, she's selling earrings. Here they are, actually. So we are advocating here in Kansas City to really empower our communities to make lifestyle changes. I think one of the kind of, I don't know, we're not there yet, but I just want to say this. One of the missing things about the Black Lives Matter, it was just like, oh, it's only about Black people. No, let's include all communities, Asian owned, LGBTQIA owned, like all these different people who don't look like us. Let's not forget about them. And so that's just what I'm doing, is amplifying those voices that are so minimal. And I'm using kind of everything that's been instilled in me to really instilled through education, because if you want to learn about life, be a teacher. So all those things that have been instilled in me to really amplify those voices. And so our motto is to locate, support, repeat. We locate Black-owned businesses, we support them, and then we repeat that process, as my son is saying, with another Black-owned business. And so we just are grateful for like all the things that have come, and I can't wait to tell you about some of the challenges that we face, because I sit here smiling and ready to talk about it, but like internally there are things that go on that you just wouldn't even imagine. So I'm grateful to be here, and I can't wait to share more.
Yes, and yes, one of my questions is challenges, so we will get to that. Let me ask a follow-up question, Chelsea, if I can. Did you find, as you started this work, I mean, the Black-owned businesses in Kansas City, were they fragmented from one another? I mean, were they having conversations with one another? What did you find as you started to kind of do that work?
Yeah, so that's where I did have to use a little bit of my PhD degree, like my quantitative analysis. A large percentage of them didn't even know about each other. So there's this mentality of kind of like, I don't know how to say it any better than this, dog eat dog. So I'm not going to tell you about how to be a great entrepreneur or what I'm doing, because I'm afraid you might steal my idea and then take it and do something else with it. So we really are challenging everyone to be kind of this collaborative community to share what is your expertise about using this tax preparer or this accounting department, so that we all don't keep making the same mistakes. We can just learn and grow from each other. But then also challenging our city leaders and other entities to provide additional support and kind of move some money around so that we can have, services at a fractional cost as opposed to full advantage. Like, so there's a lot of moving parts. Another wonderful thing that I found out was most of my entrepreneurs are Black-owned women, or women that are Black-owned. So mothers, wives, women, we work like multiple jobs. We come home, do another job. So a lot of them are entrepreneurs as well. So those are some of the things that I've noticed. But yeah, very divided, just cliquish. So just like bringing everyone together so that we can kind of work even better together.
Good. Great. Thank you. And yes, we definitely will come back to, we want to talk about successes and challenges. So we will come back through, but let's go to Kenny. Just kind of explain who you are and how you got involved in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, I'm actually taking notes on each of you, like really interesting things. So, short story. So I work for Ashoka now. I lead our, so Ashoka, I think some of you may know what it is. It's the largest network of systemic social entrepreneurs in the world, and I can share more about that later. I've been connected to Ashoka for a long time, and currently I co-lead Hello World, which is our global initiative connected to people on the move or migrants. And I also lead our search and selection process in Europe and connected to some other stuff. How I got into it is probably a long answer, but you'll hear me. I have an American accent because I was actually born in the US. I was raised as a kind of in what we call a missionary family in Barcelona. So kind of that dual or that third culture kid is probably the best way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, from a young age, some of that for me, there was always this really interesting connection. I was attracted to business and efficiency and efficacy, which aren't always the same thing, by the way. But I thought they were as a kid. I'm like, businesses must be the most effective things in the world, and then you meet a lot of businesses. And also social justice, you know, and at some point at the end of my college degree here in Madrid, I got an opportunity to work for this organization called Ashoka, which as I heard of them, I was pretty convinced it was a cult because it was just a strange name. No one knew what social entrepreneurs were back then. Particularly here was a very strange concept. I was like, you do what? But it kind of grabbed me, right? Like a couple of things, you know, the founder of Ashoka coined this term social entrepreneur. That's now quite widely used. And when we talk about that, we don't mean someone who's starting a business with a social aim, but rather someone who feels and looks and thinks like an entrepreneur. So, you know, obsessed with changing the market, building stuff, taking them apart, building them again, trying in different ways, you know, an entrepreneurial drive. But rather than making a profit, which is very important for businesses, they're aiming to solve a social problem, which often ensures that they never make money, but it doesn't always have to go that way. And so I was just fascinated with that figure and started getting into that, launched something in Spain that we called Young Changemakers to kind of build the pipeline, right, of social entrepreneurs. And then I kind of dropped all of this. It was going really well. And I moved to the US to become a pastor. So I thought, and I think this is interesting, at least, and I don't get to talk about this too much. But I went to Trinity and Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago. And I told everyone I'm leaving Ashoka, I'm leaving this practical work and going into pastoral work. And I thought they were two different worlds that were completely disconnected. Right. And when I got to the States through a number of different things, including being able to be part of what's now called the Forum for Theological Education, which is kind of the Lilly Endowment.
Yep.
I was the token white evangelical, by the way, in there. So it was really interesting for me because I didn't know what white evangelicalism was. I didn't grow up around it. But neither was I aware of all the other expressions of faith that existed, at least not at the level that I was able to encounter. So a couple of things happened throughout that. And then I worked as a pastor in Kansas City for a couple of years. Both were shocking to me. I'm not from the Midwest either. My parents are from California. So like going to the Midwest, to white evangelical world, to Kansas City, which is a very racially divided and like messed up city in a lot of different ways. I love that you connected just to say that, but you know, and acknowledging this takes a lot of effort, right? But a couple things happened that I think kind of flew or flowed into kind of next steps, at least in my life. First, we kind of discovered racism, right? Because so you may see my wife's silhouette walking around. My wife is Spanish, but very white skinned, et cetera, but has a little accent, right, in English. And when we were in the States, she was treated a little differently than me, and I could never figure it out. I was like, well, maybe you're not smiling enough. Or, you know, maybe you need to speak to, you know, and then someone's like, oh, I think that's called microaggressions. I'm like, what? You know, and like we didn't even know because we had never experienced any kind of racism. And I never have, you know, I'm a white Protestant, you know, guy with an American accent. Like, and we started realizing there's something going on here that's really messed up. Right. And so that really shook our world in different ways. And we started seeing there's something wrong. And there's different classes of citizens, and we're at the top. And like, what do we do with that? I think often when you travel to another country, it's a lot easier to see racism because it's separate, right? Americans are also really good at exaggerating things, you know. We are, but obviously we had it too, you know. So that really shaped us, and I'll get into that maybe later. But the other thing was kind of this connecting worlds, where I thought I was leaving practical business, social things to go into pastoral work, and you're like, hold on. this is what's needed here. Like we need to keep connecting these different worlds and these different groups. You know, one definition of sin is separation.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's Pantinka. I mean, like, how do you connect these things? So that sort of, that shaped us, I think, ruined us for life in a very good way. This was also, you know, right during kind of a key part of the Black Lives Matter movement. We went back to Spain right before Trump was elected, came back for some training with City to City in New York, right when Trump was elected. And that next Sunday, I got to speak in our church in Kansas City. So that was like really interesting, living through these different pieces. And figuring out what that means. So fast forward just a little bit, moved back to Spain. The church thing doesn't work out for a number of reasons. And I get a call from Ashok again. Hey, there's this, so the so-called migration crisis, which wasn't a crisis, but Europeans like to complain a lot about migration. You know, over 1 million people, mostly Syrians and others, arriving in Europe, this opportunity for work. And at Ashoka, a few staff had said, let's do something about this. You know, we have all these social entrepreneurs around the world that have solutions for stuff that kind of underlies the migration integration process. Why don't we invite them here and scale their initiatives and, you know, get different stuff? So they said, you want to lead that? And I was like, maybe that's God's work for me. I mean, very spiritual here, because the practical is so spiritual and this practical, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, maybe this is it. You know, maybe this is much more important than leading a church. It's the moment to do this. And so I started, I joined Ashok again and started leading this thing we call Hello Europe.
Yeah. That
is now scaled globally to, there's Hello Europe, Hola America. And even in that process, and we can talk about this if it's interesting, but trying to figure out how do you scale something in a organization led from the US, a very global organization, but very white, philanthropic. You know, there's a white old man that leads the organization that, you know, like all these organizations, but how do you subvert that from within as well?
Yeah.
Creating social change. So even like one thing we did was, as our staff in Latin America was like, we want to launch something around migration. We said, okay, but we're not going to lead it from Europe. We'll give you everything we have, but it would be the dumbest idea in the world for Europeans to tell people how to do migration. Like we invented this mess through colonization, etc. So there's been a lot of learnings, there are a lot of mistakes, a lot of, but anyway, that's a bit of my journey. I'm kind of always at that crossroads.
Well, it's interesting to me because what's fascinating is you start with Ashoka and then you go and are going to do pastoral ministry, and I think have this epiphany or the realization that these things are interconnected. So that in a sense you're still doing pastoral ministry, and maybe this leads to a question that I'd be interested to ask you. And this would go for all of you, but we'll start with Kenny. I mean, so take migration and immigration. It seems like it's harder to have these conversations and seek solutions in the church right now because things have become so kind of polarized in different ways. Is it possible? So this is my question. Is it easier to try to take on these issues in that kind of entrepreneurial area? Are people more likely in business or in those areas to kind of take up that issue? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, there's so many layers to it, but I think the short answer, or one of the short answers, is yes. I mean, I think, but even before saying that, like every change process involves an ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, if we think of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is very much in our head, right? There has to be someone yelling out, stop, and putting signs out and saying, this is messed up, just to get people's attention. But there also are a number of other people, right? There's legislators that need to say, okay, how do we make this stop? There's people creating new organizations. There's, all these different pieces. There's pastors, speaking about it or refusing to speak out, So I think with any system where we're looking for a change, it's similar. I think one of the privileges or one of the advantages of leading kind of from this social innovation aspect, and particularly one of the focuses we've given it, is there's an opportunity and there's solutions around migration. Let's talk about that. There's problems. Yes, we know the problems. We must study them. We must go deep, because any good innovation is based on knowing the problem very well. Any good entrepreneur spends much more time studying the problem than the solution, because the deeper you get, the easier or the sexier the solution is. Often the way we put it, right? You suddenly see it. And I think in that sense, one thing that I've found that's been really helpful is the way we bring solutions to the table to say, hey, there's people doing stuff that's really interesting. Yeah. A lot of them are migrant change makers. This is actually bringing a lot of great stuff to our community. Let's think about that. If you think about churches, the majority of the world of churches, as particularly in Europe, are migrants, for
Yeah.
example. So even involving them, and another thing we've seen is a lot of the grassroots initiatives that are actually welcoming migrants, involving in society, are faith driven. So there's a way to kind of spin that and say, actually, this is happening. I wonder if we want to get on board.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's
good.
Getting close to the
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, Chelsea or Bailey, I don't know if you want to jump in on that question as well. I guess the question for me is, and maybe this is a part of what has drawn you to the work that you're doing, but is there an opening in entrepreneurship that maybe gets closed off in other places? So Bailey, I don't know if you have a response, and then we'll go to Chelsea. But
yeah, I think so. I think similar to what Kenny said, when you have a solution that you're already providing for people to come on board with, and you're not just presenting what the issue is and what the problem is, I think people are a lot more hesitant to just, get it. Well, I don't think people are hesitant in debating issues, but I think when you say, here's a solution that we're working towards, and also back it up with data, these are, the impacts that we're seeing because of the solution and showing the positive impacts, then I think it's a lot easier for people to get involved and on board and excited about it. So I would say that, yeah, entrepreneurship has that opening that maybe other ministries might not.
Sure. Thanks. Chelsea, did you want to jump in too?
I want to jump in, but my words aren't all as
That's okay.
fluid.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Come back to that one.
Okay, we'll come back to that one. Great. Well, let's talk about successes. Where have you seen change happen in the work that you've been doing? So Chelsea, we'll start with you with this question, but where have you seen progress? Where have you seen movement? What keeps you doing this work?
I know. Yeah. So I've seen change within the city, right? So we have different partnerships with the mayor's office, with Visit KC, which is a prominent entity here, since our hospitality and tourism is very heavy in Kansas City. So I think, providing a solution to the community, like we just talked about, it opens up doors to say ooh, what's behind this door that was an issue, right? And so one of those is access to capital. So being this, I think I went to apply for a loan one time and the bank said, well, you're a social, I think she called me a social influencer. It's just we don't really have a category for that. And so we aren't able to, loan you out any money. And I was just okay, that doesn't really make sense. So it's I'm a great organization. But I feel I'm very unorthodox in that I won't be able to qualify for grants or specific scholarships or loans. So then it makes it harder on me. But it's well, if you help me, then standing behind me can also help 300 plus, Black entrepreneurs. And so the city is now, we have a new city manager, and they're big on incubators and ecosystems. And so we're talking about how we can create a thriving, bountiful incubator space where Black entrepreneurs can have co-working space. They can come and use the copier, and so the city has a biz care office, so you can come ask questions about your business, because we want businesses to thrive. And so I think the data, we did, the city and I, with that office, we collected some data. So the data is showing that, I don't have specific numbers, I wish I did, but it's showing that most of these 0 to 3 year businesses, they're not maintaining, they're not sustaining, they're kind of disseminating the license and then coming back as something else under the same owner. So they're trying to minimize that and provide more support. And so they know that they have me kind of as this liaison where they don't have to hire someone else. They can just say, okay, well, we'll work with her. And so that's some changes that I have seen kind of quickly over the 3 years that I feel like other cities may not have that advantage. But being how Kenny was saying, Kansas City, we're known for some certain things around here. And so the fact that we're kind of moving in this progressive way, I'm almost shocked. I'm almost shocked.
Yeah.
It's been a journey, especially from like the death threats that I got in the beginning
Oh,
to
wow.
now, people like, okay, well, yeah, all right, well, cool.
Yeah.
So that's kind of.
And so you see the city beginning to see what you're doing and kind of getting behind you and supporting the work that you're doing.
Right. And I think I had a guy ask me last week, he was like, if someone else did what you did, if they started this type of business, do you think they would have the same amount of success? And I confidently said no, because I was like, you have to have a level of tenacity. And because I have worked in some very rigorous schools, very hard parents, I think that has kind of strengthened me. But then also, favor isn't fair when you're covered by God. Like when you're chosen, you're just, go through the fire, but you won't get burned type thing. So
Sure.
I confidently said that. No one has, I don't think, seen that part of the video of the interview. No one said anything to me. So I guess it wasn't that bad for me to say that.
All right.
So high heavy.
Good. Thank you. Good. Yeah. Bailey, what would you say you have seen, some of the success stories that you've seen in your work?
Yeah. So our work is, primarily to take these women out of these vulnerable communities in the Horn of Africa and show them that, they can rise out of poverty and that they can help their families rise out of poverty. And so we've seen that in a couple of different ways. Like I said, we have 11 artisans. And so one of our artisans, her name is Becca, and she was one of our newest artisans. And the last time I went to visit, which was February of 2021, I haven't been back since I also recently was pregnant and had my second daughter. So haven't been able to go back to the country. But when we went last, we did a bunch of home visits, going to each of their houses and seeing and just talking with their families and seeing how the past couple of years have helped their situations. And so Decca is in a family of 7 other people that live in her household. And before she was partnering with Dreamer & Co., there was no one in her family that was bringing home regular income. So her father is a really hard worker, but he can only get day jobs. So maybe he has the job one day, but the next day he doesn't. So her mother was telling us about how a lot of weeks she couldn't provide food for them. But now Decca is bringing home a regular monthly income in partnership with us. And so she is able to provide for her family. She's also helping send her sister to school. And then she started teaching her mother how to sew, which is really amazing too. So her mother is now able to, go around the neighborhood and help tailor people's dresses and whatnot. So that's one really awesome story that was really cool for us to learn after being in business for 3 years at the time. And then Zam is another one of our artisans. She comes from a really hard background. All of them do, but there's varying degrees. And she lives in probably the poorest part of the slum. So when you think of a slum and think about like the ditch of the slum, and like that's where she lives. And so they had one room of their house, which is, 2x4s, and then they had like an outdoor kitchen. Well, she used some of the money that she made through working with us to build another room for her brother's family, because originally her father and her brother's sister, another brother and his wife and their 3 kids were all living in one room. And so she helped use her money to build another house on their little property, which is really cool. So we have a picture of her in front of the house like this, and just really proud of the work that she did and helping provide for her family. And then another artisan used money to build a latrine, a toilet in her home, which a lot of the women that we work with, they don't have toilets in their home. And so she was able to use money to expand her home and build that. So it's been really cool to see those kind of stories. Also just the environment that these women get to work in. So the artisans that we partner with, they are their own business. They're what's called an association in their country that they form themselves. So we just partner with them. We didn't want to come in and take over what they were doing. So we don't employ them directly, which we think is better because we're teaching them how to run a sustainable business on their own. And they are in this in the project house that the nonprofit started. That's where they work out of, and they get to be in this environment together. And it's always fun to go visit because they're just so silly and they have so much fun, like sitting around this table working. And so that's another aspect of the work that we do. Is one of our values is having these women work in a safe, clean, fun working environment. And so they just love being around each other, which is really great. And then with this new initiative, it's so young, the refugee job program. So we haven't been able to like measure success yet, but it's been really cool just to be involved personally with the family that the woman that we work with is living with, because she has her parents are here, and then she has her kids, and so just being able to invest in the family, not just Miss Rosanna is what her name is, has been really inspiring.
Good. Let me ask a quick follow-up question. I mean, so have you sensed growing support for the work that you're doing? Like, as you go out and seek support for the women and their businesses, how have you seen that grow?
Yeah. Do you mean, maybe clarify what kind of support? Just like involvement or investment?
Investments. That's a better word. Yes. Yeah.
So right now we are a for-profit business. We chose to be a for-profit business in the beginning, one, because it was an easier way to just get started without having to apply. Chelsea down there, when she said, we're a for-profit, but we want to be a nonprofit, I was like, I got you, girl. I'm right there with you. So we started that way. And then also philosophically, when we first started, we thought that we wanted to show that this can be done. Business can be done in an impactful way, in a sustainable way. And so philosophically, like, that was also where we were coming from. Now, after being in it 5 years, we really see that the waters are very muddled between nonprofit and for-profit in this social enterprise space. And we can talk more about that when we get down to challenges. But so far we haven't done any fundraising rounds. We just haven't felt like we were at that place yet. We actually were about to last summer do a round of fundraising, but I had a baby, and so like life happens. And so we just decided to hold off, and now we're kind of in a phase where we do want to become a nonprofit. And that has to do with the fact that we have a lot of people that want to support us, but they want to do it under a nonprofit because they want the tax write-off, versus you have angel investors who are, patient investors, and they see the impact. But the people that we have are more on this side versus the angel investor side. So I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. Good. Thank you. So Kenny, let's come to you. What in your work, and again, I understand the word success is probably problematic. I get that. But where have you seen growth? Where have you seen the seeds of change, if that makes any sense?
I mean, I think we just have to define success, right? Like, it's not necessarily a bad word. I think two things that I'll share, because there's so much. I mean, there's the party line, right? There's very specific things I could share if I was pitching to you to try to get you to give me money. And they're true too, but there's two that like really excite me. One is, with the Hello Europe and Hello World work, the primary thing that we started doing was accelerators for social innovators. So, folks like, some of you may know David LaBelle, who founded Welcoming America, or Jane Lewis, who founded Upwardly Global. Bailey, if you don't know that organization, that's a really cool one to connect with, because they help refugees kind of connect with high-level, high-paying jobs in the U.S. Or the Interfaith Mediation Group in Nigeria, that was like an imam and a pastor who hated each other, had a dream about each other, and then reconciled and built this organization. So we invited folks like this to Germany and to different countries to train and to scale locally in new ways. So that, that was really cool. That was part of our work. We launched 14 of these across 15 countries in Europe, and then in Latin America, we've been in Argentina, Chile, Colombia now, doing other stuff. So that some really cool numbers there. And one thing that happened in that process is we started seeing, it's great for these organizations to replicate, but there's so many synergies between them. One of them is public policy, like getting together and influencing public policy, and in Europe in particular, European public policy, which is a bizarre world, because you have local, you have national, you have municipal, then you have the EU, and no one knows how that works.
Right.
And so we built like a policy unit there to connect them and stuff. And then the thing I got really excited about that we've tested this year is what we called an ecosystem accelerator. So what we did was basically say, okay, what's a topic that we're seeing a lot of energy around and a potential to change? And in this case, we chose migrant entrepreneurship and employment in Europe, because basically when migrants arrived in Europe, a large number, our entrepreneurship numbers skyrocketed. Mostly non-European founders, so like migrants, but also Europeans became more entrepreneurial. Like if you raise entrepreneurial levels in the city, it raises for everyone, which is really interesting. And so we said, well, this is an opportunity for Europe, but entrepreneurs from migrant background and from many other backgrounds that are excluded, like Roma and Sinti people and Black people in Europe. There's a lot of Black people in Europe that we never show anywhere that are excluded, even if they've been living there for centuries. And so, we said, how do we frame this as an opportunity? And we built this ecosystem accelerator where we chose 2 or 3, in this case, like 3 key social entrepreneurs that were kind of leading the conference, and their energy led this group. And then we had researchers, key policy people, like OECD and Migration Policy Group, which is a really big group. We had migrant entrepreneurs, which is important. I'll bring that in a second. And media and, a few different people, about 15 people. And we said, let's apply the acceleration strategies or the scaling strategies that we use for individuals to an ecosystem. So say, okay, you're all great. You all have great work. Drop that for a second. And let's think about the ecosystem together. Then you can steal anything you learn here, steal it, take it home, use it for whatever, but let's build this together. And it was a really powerful experience because, we always have these groups of people getting together to think about stuff. But it generally is driven by a business or one social entrepreneur that wants it for themselves, or government, or some public thing that makes it slower, or a bunch of friends that get together. No one really wants to lead it, or, but we realize if you place the social entrepreneur at the center, often that there's this drive for action, and you have to kind of, whoa, slow down, Anyway, that resulted in a really interesting. Here, I'll drop the link in here in a second when I'm done. Sure. Kind of paper of recommendations and building a backbone organization across Europe for this. And so as that's happening, there's another piece that I think I'm more, and that's very successful and very exciting, and we want to do more of those, kind of finding those intersections with topics like migration and gender, right? Or migration and race, or migration and planet and climate. Some of the best people that know most how to care for the planet are migrating to countries where we've completely lost our notions of how to care for the planet. What if we tapped into their wisdom instead of considering them unskilled labor or whatever? There's stuff like this that we think we can build this around. But kind of in parallel to that, and one thing, I think Kansas City was very influential for me on this, because when we were there, I was part of a very large, very rich white church. And that was my pastoral job, but I'll be careful because there may be someone here, but we needed something different, and God was also kind of speaking to us about this racial thing. We're like, what do we do? And we were invited to a Black church, to Palestine Missionary Baptist Church, which is this large Black church that's never received any money from white communities in Kansas City. It's on the east side of True Street, which is the street that kind of divides historically the community. And we just started going there. And just learning and sitting there and sitting under Black leadership, which was a huge change for us and something that was very interesting. But the thing that it led me to see was like, I learned so much about leadership and just giving the right people leadership rather than the white or the powerful or, certain kinds of people with their money and with their donations, telling other organizations how to run. And so, when we were doing all this stuff for Ashoka, one thing that happened was we realized we're saying, every migrant a change maker, everyone should be a change maker. And then we do this, like we did this one conference in Brussels where we had 200 major decision makers across Europe, 20, social entrepreneurs that scale globally. And in the room of those 200 something people, there are about 2 or 3 visibly migrant people. You know, maybe there were 2 or 3, but you know, people where you're like, okay, and we're like, this is a problem, right? Because we're saying every migrant change maker, but then we're showing all these white European leaders as the change makers. And so that really, I started thinking, how do we change this in Ashoka? You know, how do we? And we realized we're not, like, we've lost a bit of our vision, particularly in Europe, or our drive to select proximate leaders, which is we didn't use that term back then because it was coined just a couple of years ago. But I love that term. You know, people that are in the community, close to the community. How do we get closer to that? And we realize our systems were built in a way that it's really hard to hire or to select people from migrant background or from underrepresented background. So that's when I went back to the team in Europe and said, I want to lead our venture process, our search and selection process again. And let's shift this thing around. Let's change our diversity metrics and stuff. Because there's kind of a realization we could try to hire people from underrepresented backgrounds, you know, bring them through our very complex, very strange hiring process and have like interns or low-level leaders, you know, from diverse backgrounds. And by the time they become, you know, they work through the system, we probably ruin them and all their cultural richness is lost. Or we could select fellows. You know, Ashoka adores our fellows. This is what we're built on. They're demigods. They're like saints, right? Well, why don't we shift our processes so we're selecting these leaders and supporting them as leaders so they come in kind of at this high level, and that's something we started doing. And for me, that's one of the biggest victories I've seen or biggest successes is shifting from like 20% people coming from underrepresented backgrounds in our European selection process. We select about 40 to 50 fellows every year to 40 to 60%. And it's not about quotas either. Our process hasn't necessarily changed, but it's about how do you change the way you're looking at something? And a lot of that comes from building the vision, right? And I've drawn a lot from Dr. King, you know, the end isn't boycott, the end isn't numbers, or the end is beloved community. What is a beloved community of social entrepreneurs look like? And how do we build that together? And bring people in as leaders, not as someone to be trained and to be tutored, you know, by the white rich person. Because that's what happens a lot. Like in Kansas City, a lot of the work, and probably across the US, but that was my experience. A lot of the work with local organizations, there were these rich churches or people or whatever that were very much influencing how that had to work. But if the money is raised in the community, often it's much more powerful and it works better and it requires less. So shifting those dynamics is something I'm very much kind of dedicated to, and seeing some of those successes for me is where I get really excited.
Oh, that's awesome. So we are getting close to the end here, but I've got a lot of questions left. So what I want to do is combine. I want to hear the challenges. I think that's important. So let's talk about what are the challenges, and then. So the 3 questions I have left are challenges, faith, and advice. And so what I'll do is take those 3 things and kind of put them into one, and you can speak to it however you'd like. What are some of the challenges? How does your faith inform the work that you do? What advice would you give someone who's starting out? You don't have to address all 3 if you don't want, but maybe as kind of a closing, like, all right, you know, how do you make sense of these things? So we'll start with Bailey, and then we'll just kind of move around to everybody. Oh, you're still on mute, it looks like.
Sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
So thank you for the questions. I think one of the challenges in general that we've seen for bringing about ethical impact through business, one of the significant challenges is the tension between profit and social impact, because we're trying to straddle both. Well, there's actually multiple bottom lines we're trying to straddle, but those are kind of like those at the forefront. So in traditional business models, the primary focus is maximizing profits and shareholder value. But in ethical business, you need to balance financial sustainability with social impact, environmental impact, et cetera. So it can create challenges for individuals and organizations that are seeking to use business as a tool for positive change. So for example, we want to pay, and we do pay, a fair and living wage to our artisans. That in turn is going to reduce our profit margin. because we're competing against other businesses who purchase cheap labor from developing countries and aren't paying fair wages. So like I know every single cost that goes into producing our pieces, and then I know like the margins we need to put on it to sell at wholesale, and then the additional margin we need to put on it to sell at retail. And so when I go to a store, I can pretty easily determine how much money the maker earns when I see a price, just because I know how we price our items for the market, and I know how the industry typically marks things up. So when I see a shirt on Amazon for like $5, I know that the person who's making that shirt is making less than pennies per hour. So it's like this mental mathing I do like anytime I go to shop, which makes it really hard to shop in the world that we're in. So it's a really difficult market because we live in this market where you can get things cheap and fast, and you have consumers that may not value your items at the price that you need to set it at in order to make a sustainable profit. That's another reason why education is like a huge part of what we do with Dreamer & Co. Because especially for our scenario, the country that we work in is the most expensive country in Africa to live. So the cost of living is just really high, and there's a lot of factors that play into it. But we make products that are similar to other organizations that are doing good like us, but the cost of living is different. And so we're not only competing against like the cheap Amazon product, we're also competing against other ethical business that are paying 3 times the minimum wage, but their 3 times the minimum wage is $3 a day and ours is $3 an hour. So there comes problems in that. And that's kind of one of the challenges that I alluded to earlier that we're facing is we are a for-profit, and we had this philosophical mindset of we really want to be a for-profit to show that business can do good and be sustainable. But we've come to this kind of point where our mission in the end is actually more important than our proving a point about business. And so that's one of the reasons why we're trying to transition to a nonprofit so that we can sustain ourselves with competing against labor that might not be valued, like the product that they're making isn't valued at the labor that we need to set it at in order for them to earn a living wage. And then kind of for how faith plays into that, I mean, in all those decisions that we're making, it plays a huge role. I feel like God has been leading us through this whole thing, and it really truly wouldn't be without him. And it also is how we initiated this work. As believers in this world, we see things that are not how God intended them to be. Our world is broken and darkness is pervasive. And as image bearers of God, it's our duty. We're called to push back against the darkness with the light of Christ, and so redemption in the world. And so God's call to love is woven into our business and into our mission to bring about flourishing, to promote meaningful vocation. And flourishing is this, huge word in everything that we do. And because we see that's, just harking back to the Garden of Eden. So each piece of jewelry that is made by our partner artisans and now by our Afghani refugee, they're created by hand, and the peace and joy of flourishing is just so evident in our commitment to the women and the way we celebrate their value and their dignity. So our hope in partnering with them is that it will help them have a shared vision for vocation, which is something that they maybe would have never thought of before. We organized a business training for the women a couple of years ago. And as part of that, my co-founder Jessica was helping lead it. And one of the things they had to do is write about what their goals were, what their dreams were. And they had never been asked to dream or to have goals for their future. And so to be able to give them a vision for vocation that includes stewarding like their gifts of creativity, stewarding diligence, and cooperation with the gifts that God has given them through work. So you might have tell Jason, if you looked at our website or just anything with Dreamer & Co, we don't, and reading our mission statement, we don't outwardly profess our commitment of faith, because we work in a country that is closed. 98% of the women, or 98% of the people in the country that we work in are Muslim. So we don't name the country that we live in, and we don't really profess faith just for their protection and security. But we have this unique opportunity to transform lives that will, go through generations. I mean, not only the spiritual impact, but the economical impact. Because research indicates when you put income into the hands of women, that's when child nutrition, health, and education improve. And so, I think being able to weave that with God has been, really humbling. And especially when we come across these challenges. And I think recently the humbling challenge has been, okay, God, like I think that you're shifting how this is going to be done, and we're not just here to prove a point, but we're here to further our mission.
Good. No, that's wonderful. And yeah, to hear you talk about flourishing, and I mean, these are some of the same things that I know Eric and I have talked about as we've talked about kind of this major that we're starting and so on. Chelsea, if you could maybe talk about some of the challenges you face, and then how does faith play into this?
I'll be honest, when I first started out, I was a little nervous to share my faith just because of again, where I am in Kansas City, but also I've never really witnessed to someone. I've been a Christian, but I've never had the opportunity to share my faith or share how my relationship with God has impacted my life in a certain way. And so being an entrepreneur is a faith walk, especially in this journey that I'm taking, because, my revenue model, we're all over the place right now. We've tried. When I say we, I just mean me, because I'm a solo entrepreneur. So I've tried different things to bring in revenue. One thing that seems to be working right now is memberships. But then also we have this inflation on the economy. We have Black business owners who don't have angel investors, who don't have investors, period. They can't ask their parents. So it comes back to me as okay, but I know that a value that I provide, but then on the back end, my family and I, we've been good. God's been good. God's been faithful. So it's definitely a faith walk, as long as, I'm continuing to tithe. But there have been little small moments where I've met with a business owner, maybe we're doing a social media audit, and they're talking about, well, I just left my 9-to-5 and this and that and this and that. So I have used those little moments to share the good news or share the gospel with them, as opposed to outwardly, just because so many different types of people follow me and connect with me. It's just I'm still trying to finagle my way through that. But another challenge is just access to capital, right? So just outside of these membership opportunities, I'm okay, maybe I should be nonprofit, but that's so much more paperwork. I have to find a board. It's just a lot. So it's well, how can I make money to keep doing this? I need some revenue. So so a lot of in-kind donations are brought our way. And that's why I really heavily depend on my connections in the community. So the city is hey, you need a space to pop up? We got spaces for you. Great, thank you. Because renting a space is so much more. So I think I definitely have favor in that aspect. And then I'm just grateful that my husband has a job, because if it was just all on me, we'd be in trouble. But I'm just on this faith walk, right? Because sometimes I even think for those of us that have spouses and are entrepreneurs, they kind of carry more on their back, because we're just, we both carry, the same, but it's I'm out here, I'm grinding, I'm hustling, I'm trying to figure out, trying to hear from God, Lord, is this what you would have me to do? And okay, this doesn't feel right. Do I go with this? Do I go with that? It's just that's the part that I need to, continue to work on, right? As an entrepreneur, listening to the voice of God to make sure that I'm in his will. I don't want to be out of the will. I want to be in the will. And when you're not in the will, you will quickly see things just go bad. And so,
no, that's good. No, thank you so much for sharing. And Kenny, we only got a couple minutes left, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share what advice you would give to somebody who wants to get involved in this work.
Die daily. Sorry.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that, I don't know if it's advice, but maybe the journey piece, right, is when you get involved in these intersections, a lot of innovation, there's a lot of opportunities, like staying centered on the issue to solve and on the systemic pieces, and kind of two things there. One, being humble and teachable. You know, in that process, being like, I don't know, there's an ecosystem. My way is not the best way, because I've been convinced the political way is the best way, then the pastoral way, then like, no, it's all these ways. They have to work together. So, being humble, working with others. How can you collaborate with others, even if it doesn't make business sense at times? Does it make sense for the systems change that you're looking for? And this may not make sense to someone at the beginning, but as you start working through this, you're like, oh my goodness, now I know what you're saying. And I think the third thing for me has been figuring out what are games that you play and what are the serious things that you believe. So like, I'm in a large organization where there's a lot of political infighting and games, like what's the best initiative, and that happens a lot at city levels or whatever. You have to compete with people. You have to keep reminding yourself, this is just a game that you play, and I have to tell these stories about myself and how great I am, and talk about I, because that's part of the game, and maybe it's not my time to change the rules. But then to get home and have friends or people around you to be like, but that was the game. That's not really me. I need help, or I'm better than what I just did. Finding those spaces where you can kind of disconnect from that work and say, and hopefully it's a community or a church or something that it often isn't for people. A church is a place where you have to play the game even harder. Have to smile bigger and wear extra masks. But those have been kind of some of the spaces that I really sought, because you get into this stuff and there's some heavy stuff that you run into and that you see, and you have to deal with that somewhere, and you either hide it away and just keep working, or take the easy path, or you lament with it, you sit with it, you talk to different people, you say, how do I move this forward? So that, I don't even know if that makes sense, but it's a struggle when you're trying to solve social issues that are systemic. That they're systemic for a reason.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. It's been great. There's a lot more we could talk about. One question I have, Kenny, is that a donut in the background that keeps popping out at me? Because I am very hungry.
Same question.
It's a donut pillow. And
oh my word! I'm like, this donut keeps popping out as you move around, and my stomach keeps growling. So no, that's great. But
it's the official Simpsons. I think it's the official Simpsons donut that we got at Universal Studios.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and we wish you God's blessing on your work, and hopefully we can find ways to connect. I would love, as this major grows and we get students and so on. We might be kind of tapping you on the metaphorical shoulder and saying, hey, do you got some space to whatever insights for students and so on. But thank you so much. We will make this video available here at some point, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of it.